I don't know if I ever told you this story, but when I first started in real estate down in Georgia, my very first open house, I got there like 30, 45 minutes early to get set up, and pest control must have just come. It was covered in dead roaches. So and there was nothing in the house. I went over the whole house to find a broom, and my very first task in real estate was to sweep up a bunch of dead roaches. So I'll never forget that.
They never put that on $1 million listings.
Right. All right, welcome back to the channel. Today's a little bit different. We're hopping in the car and heading to beautiful Belgrade Lakes, which is about a 25-minute drive from Augusta. And while we make that quick trip, we're putting Matt in the hot seat, answering 50 real estate questions, everything from first-time buyer tips to Maine market myths. Belgrade Lakes is one of those classic Maine destinations. Think peaceful roads, a charming little village, and some of the most iconic lake views in Central Maine. Nestled between Great Pond and Long Pond, it's a year-round haven for outdoor lovers, with boating, swimming, golf, hiking, and even a great farmer's market. So if you're thinking that all sounds great, but what about everyday life? Well, that's where Augusta comes in. It's Maine's capital city and just down the road. You'll find major grocery stores, hardware shops, medical offices, and even a regional hospital. So if you're living in Belgrade Lakes full-time, you're never far from everything you need. So the real question is, can Matt answer 50 real estate questions in the time it takes us to get there?
I hope so.
You tend to be a little long-winded. You got to be concise.
All right, I'll be fast,
okay.
Kyle. And we should probably buckle up, going down the road.
Matt doesn't know the questions, but I get to cheat. I have them here on the sheet.
All right, let's shoot.
All right, Matt, how much do I need for a down payment on a home in Maine?
Well, that really depends on what kind of loan that you're using. So you want me to not be long-winded, I'll keep it short. There are products available where people can actually buy a home with $0 down in Maine. In some cases, you can even get the selling agent or the seller to contribute towards closing costs. And sometimes people finance all their closing costs, so they bring no money to the table to close.
Speaking of closing costs, and I'm just adding this one in there, buyers always want to know, how much are my closing costs going to be? What do you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, typically the closing costs are going to range anywhere from, 4 to 5% of what the purchase price of the property is. That includes paying your buyer agent fee, which can range anywhere from, 2 to 3%, let's say, depending on the agreement that you have with your buyer agent, and also, additional closing costs that the bank has for things like title search, deed preparation, appraisal, things of that nature. And so those get added in closing costs. And so generally on average, somewhere around that, 3 to 5% range total.
I think I can probably guess your answer to this next question. Should I buy or rent right now?
To be honest with you, I'm very bullish about buying, but it's not for everybody. I mean, some people are in a situation where they don't know where they're going to be for the next, say, 5 years. And if you have a purchase and then you sell again in a year, sometimes the transaction costs associated with that, the closing costs we just discussed, can eat up your equity in the property. But, life happens. We don't all have a crystal ball. I think in general, buying real estate is always a sensible move. But for some people, it's not the right fit. People need to look at kind of how committed they are to an area, whether it's for themselves or if it just happens to be a situation where they want to keep owning a property for rent.
So everyone's situation is different, but just any general advice on someone who's renting right now, maybe buying isn't in the cards for them at the moment, just in terms of a long-term plan, what kinds of things should they be doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely important to have a property that is in your budget, and so it's first to start with the numbers. And a lot of times people are paying more in rent than they would pay for owning a property. When we start looking at if they buy maybe a multifamily instead of a single family home, the people who are paying rent could contribute to that. But essentially, the biggest thing is start with your budget and start with what it is that you can realistically afford, because a lot of times people get an approval for a loan and they just start thinking, well, that's how much I can afford, and the bank's only looking at it as a percentage of your overall debt. You really need to kind of take into consideration what you can really afford.
Right. What is a red flag you always look for at a showing?
So when I'm showing property, with buyers, first and foremost, we're looking for structural integrity of the property as best we can tell visually, and making sure there aren't a lot of problems that the buyer is going to be inheriting if they acquire the property. Now, sometimes we don't see all of these things on an initial showing, But some things that would be red flags would be, leaking, evidence of leaks from the roof. If you check the property disclosure and it doesn't look like the roof's been updated recently, you want to get that checked out. Another thing that really is kind of, I wouldn't say a red flag in a bad way, but just something to be mindful of, especially in Maine, is water treatment systems. We have a lot of water that is groundwater in Maine through private wells, and that well water constantly changes in terms of its makeup and what it might have in it for properties. And sometimes that water can be not great for consumption. And so if you see a water treatment system in a property, it doesn't mean that it's bad water. It just means, hey, I got to be mindful of the fact that I need to stay on top of treating this water and making sure it doesn't have any contaminants in it. So that's another one. And then a big red flag really is anytime if we see any kind of mold or mildew. That can be resolved. I often say mold is the smell of money. If you're looking at a property that, a lot of people are kind of turning away from because of that, that is something that maybe you dig in and say, well, this is a solvable problem. How much is it going to cost to fix? And then move on.
I know this isn't something that's happening as much as it was a few years ago, but I actually just had a buyer ask me about this recently. What are your thoughts about waiving inspections in order to be more aggressive in making your offer in a multiple offer situation?
Yeah, I think it depends on the property and also on the willingness and capability of the buyer to take on any issues that might come up that they didn't know about up front. So if a person listening to this as a buyer is somebody that's kind of savvy and handy and likes, rolling up their sleeves and taking on projects or finding people to do that work, and then has the financial resources to pay for it, then a home, with work is okay for them, then maybe it's all right to forego an inspection. But there's a lot of times where inspectors pick up on things that even everybody involved in the process missed. And a lot of times it can be thousands and thousands of dollars to mitigate those issues. So we really recommend an inspection, but to be competitive, that is one way to stand out in the crowd. And if you take that off the table, buyer beware, you just need to know that you're, potentially inheriting some issues that people just didn't know about that could be expensive. And if people are all right with that risk and they know it going in, then it's a good way to stand out.
All right, switching gears, what do you think is the most underrated town in Central Maine?
I am really biased toward Augusta in terms of a Central Maine location. There's a reason it was picked as the state's capital. Geographically, it was equidistant to a lot of the urban centers. So we have similar travel times to Bangor as we do to Portland, even over to Lewiston, Auburn, or out to the coast. Bangor is a little further, but all the rest are about a 45 to 50 minute drive. Bangor is a little over an hour. So it's really, I think, a great location if somebody wants to be able to have access to different areas in Maine that have things going on, but also wants to be closer to maybe to the coast and have access to job opportunities. There's a lot of open jobs in Augusta right now at the state or through the hospital or other businesses that are in the area. And relatively speaking, it's a lot more affordable than Southern Maine. So people can get a lot more for their money by coming, to Central Maine and specifically to Augusta. I think Augusta is kind of underrated because for so long it's kind of had this notion of disgusta, because the river was in rough shape and we had a lot of problems, and a lot of that's been cleaned up over the past couple decades since the mills have been gone, and we really have turned our attention back toward the river as a place of recreation and just kind of natural beauty.
On the subject of affordability, where are prices still under $300,000? Can you find anything under $300,000, and what do you get for that?
Yeah, in Augusta, you used to be able to pretty much buy any house on the market for under $300,000. Right. I remember when my wife and I bought our home a little over $400,000 back in 2020, we both looked at each other and we're like, we're absolutely crazy for doing this. Of course, Maine saw a 74% increase in pricing since 2019, so now that home is worth well over $700,000. It was a good move. And I think that that's an important, story to share with people as well, because real estate, generally speaking, doesn't go down in value over the long haul. You might see blips in time where there is a slight decrease based on, interest rates and demand, but overall, average return for real estate is just north of 7%, which is pretty close to what you're going to get in the stock market, but you can't live in your 401k.
Right. What is your dream home? Log cabin, farmhouse, or loft?
I would love an old saltwater farmhouse on the ocean someday. That's one of my goals, to acquire a property like that. That's not in Augusta. You mean in Augusta? I mean, honestly, I feel really blessed to be living in my dream home in Augusta. We're surrounded by 160 acres of conservation land. And that's another thing that a lot of people don't talk about when it relates to Augusta. You know, people are looking more for quality of life and experiences, and we have robust trail networks for mountain biking, cross-country skiing, snowshoeing, you know, whatever, right in our backyard. But we're not paying the premium that you might pay in southern Maine for some of those same features. One of the things that I love to ask buyers is when we go to look at a home, you know, we look around, and then before leaving, I'll ask them the question, you know, if it's not like evident that they've been like, wow, this is not a fit for me, or this is terrible, or we find some landmine that they just don't like, you know. But if it seems general, you know, okay, this is interesting, we can keep this on the list, I ask them this question every time. Could you see yourself living in this property? Because it's really about vision, you know, just that question alone, like what is your ideal home? You have to start with what it is that you want. And some people have that in their mind's eye for buyers, and some people don't. But ultimately, when you're in a space, if you look around and you kind of feel like, yeah, I could live here, I like this, it looks like the neighbors, you know, are going to be good neighbors, whatever the case may be, then ultimately that is kind of the litmus test. You know, if they can afford it and there aren't any problems with the property that they're going to be like a problem for them, then maybe that's a good contender.
Yep. Are interest rates going up or down?
Well, a lot of the indications are that there will be some downward pressure on interest rates, though the Federal Reserve's been really sticky about doing that. We're seeing kind of this really interesting environment right now where the Fed's role is to kind of dictate monetary policy. And when they set the rates, that impacts more consumer credit rates like credit cards and so forth. But it does have an impact on home rates as well, and a lot of that has to do with, you know, what's going on in the bond market and Treasury sales, T-bills. And so right now, you know, that has been not really where people are flocking to in terms of investments at the kind of corporate level. So there isn't as much demand to buy these mortgages as there was, and therefore the rates are higher because they're pricing in some risk. And there's nothing really on the horizon to point toward a drastic decrease in those rates. I mean, we saw that coming out of COVID because the federal government really wanted to incentivize consumer behavior, consumer spending, to kind of like get the furnace of the fire stoked up again. And now we're at the point where the Fed's looking at it and saying, wow, people are not stopping spending. You know, they're not easing back on their spending. So we are not going to ease back on the rates because that's only going to like increase more spending, which is going to cause inflation. And Fed has this dual role. They have to keep inflation down without sputtering out the economy. Yeah, and one of the things that I think a lot of times gets missed is the fact that people are using credit cards now. And so a lot of the money that's being spent is not real money that they have. It's just on a credit card.
Right, so you actually just answered my next question, was what would it do to prices if, you know, we have high home prices right now, or at least perceived high home prices, and rates were to suddenly drop on top of that?
The prices are going to go up. Why? Because we're not adding a lot of inventory. And at Pouliot Real Estate, we're really focused on truly building community. I mean, we're actively putting pieces of land under contract to subdivide and make available to people. You yourself just had a buyer last week that was struggling to find a property on the market. What's he doing? He's going to be building himself a new home. He's not going to be hiring a contractor to go out and put up the walls. He's buying a home that's built in a factory. It will be delivered to site and probably move in before the fall.
And it's beautiful. I mean, we looked at a model of it. You wouldn't even know that it was modular.
Right. And when he came to meet with us, that was not really even on his radar, you know, and now that'll be his new home.
Yep. What is a first-time buyer mistake you see a lot?
I think a lot of buyers underestimate what it is that can be done with real estate. If it's not put right in front of them, like, hey, here's your 3-bedroom, 2-bath ranch that you've been searching for, then they think there's nothing out there for them, and that's really a mistake. As you saw with this person just recently that you're working with, you know, they were like, geez, there's really nothing on the market. Well, let's make something for you, you know? And I think a lot of buyers are not considering new construction because they view it as something that is too time consuming, too risky, you know, what am I really gonna get in the end? I don't know. Those are all valid concerns. But oftentimes they take themselves right out of the market of being a buyer because of fears that are not necessarily justified.
Right. All right, so I asked you what you thought was the most underrated town in Central Maine. What is your favorite Maine lake town?
I really love...
Anywhere in the state.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I'm really partial to Belgrade Lakes. They've done a complete revamp of the Main Street in the past couple of years to include new sidewalks, streetscape, and it has just a really cool vibe. There's some great restaurants in downtown Belgrade, and
Good, I'm hungry.
Great Pond. That's good. And Great Pond is, on Golden Pond. The movie was based on that, even though they didn't shoot it there. They shot it at a lake in New Hampshire. Probably have something to do with better tax credits for making movies in New Hampshire. But, they did that based on this bucolic body of water in Central Maine, Belgrade Lakes region, which I think is really beautiful.
All right. FHA or conventional?
Depends on the buyer. FHA as a loan type can be a really great product for people that have lower credit scores and also want to put less money down. Conventional loans, you can put 3% down, which is actually less than FHA, 3.5%. But then you have, your private mortgage insurance, which can sometimes be a little bit more expensive on a conventional loan than with FHA. But an FHA does have the mortgage insurance as well.
Yep. Is there a best time of year to buy?
There really is not like the best time of year to buy. I mean, the most inventory to pick from is in the summer. I mean, the majority of listings are coming on May, June, July. However, a lot of times you're going to get your best price in October and November. You start getting into the holiday season and people just really take their eye off the prize as it relates to buying a new home for themselves or their family. And, ultimately that means less competition.
Right. How fast can someone close on a home?
Well, I've seen people close on a home in like 3 days. You really just need to get the title work done if you're buying cash. But if you're using a loan, it can take 30 or more days because you have to get an appraisal and other things.
Fixer-upper or move-in ready?
Again, depends on the buyer. I mean, I think some people are busy. They've got a lot going on in their life. They're well capitalized. They can afford to buy a home that's turnkey. Fixer-upper is a great opportunity for everybody. I think I'm bullish on fixer-uppers, but I also recognize that not everybody has the patience or the financial wherewithal to do a fixer-upper. For people that are using an FHA loan, they can get a fixer-upper. A lot of people don't know that. It's a little bit more of an intense process, but we can hold their hand through that process and get what's called a 203K loan that allows up to, I think it's 40,000 and 35 or 40,000 in renovations to the property that can all be part of the loan. So if somebody goes and they're looking at, it's their perfect dream home, but it needs to have a paint job on the outside and a new roof, you get estimates on all that stuff and they escrow the money, pay for it, after closing when the work gets done.
What about multifamily properties? A lot of buyers don't know that, the income from the property can be used in their loan, in the underwriting.
Right, exactly. A lot of times, like I had a person, for instance, was living in one of the buildings we were selling. The price is $485,000. She's like, I'm not approved for that amount. I said, well, the other two people that are living in the building have leases. You should bring that to the bank to see if they'll use that toward qualifying for the mortgage. She did that. They said, no problem, you qualify for the mortgage. So now she was a tenant in the building. Now she owns the building. She's the landlord.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I've done that twice with buildings that I own personally, but many times with people I've said, hey, look, the home that meets your needs is $300,000. You can buy a 3-unit for $400,000, which is, yes, it's $100,000 more, but now you've got that income coming in from those 2 units. And in time, if it doesn't meet your needs, just move out and rent that unit, and you've got something in your retirement to sell someday.
What's one thing buyers should never skip?
I think it's a bad idea to buy a property without looking at it in person. I mean, we do have people that do it, and that's their choice. But I just think there's something about going to a property in person, and I wouldn't skip that in-person viewing.
I've had buyers that I've shown properties to on FaceTime or whatever, and they like it enough to make an offer, then they come in to see it. No, we want to terminate.
Yeah. Yeah, and that happens. I mean, especially in this world that we live in today, a lot of people are moving to Maine from other states. We help people with that all the time. And to the extent possible, like this morning, I had a guy that flew in from California to look at a 3-unit. And he's bought a ton of other properties in Hollowell, but he was like, if I'm going to buy this one, I want to see it, in person.
What makes Maine's market unique? We could probably fill a whole episode about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think Maine is really... we're really a pretty stable market. When you look at in terms of real estate pricing, we don't see these drastic increases, although we did see the largest increase per capita since 2019, 74%. But generally speaking, we're pretty flat in terms of like, where we stay. I don't see any historical reference to point to the fact that all of a sudden now Maine's prices are going to drop off. And so I think, what makes Maine a really unique a real estate market is it's pretty steady, and also it's continuing to appreciate in a pretty, robust fashion, because people are choosing Maine as a place to live for quality of life, especially those who work from home.
Where are a lot of out-of-staters moving from? Is there like one particular area you see a lot, or just kind of from all over?
The majority of folks are actually moving from other New England states where we're seeing higher real estate values. Somebody could sell a 3-bedroom, 2-bath ranch in, say, part of Massachusetts. It's more affluent. Come up here and buy that same house for like $350 and put the other $150 in their pocket to live off.
What is your go-to coffee stop in Augusta?
I am like a Dunkin' Donuts nuts. I don't know why, but that's me. Probably their crappy coffee. I do have to give a plug though to Wrapped Up in downtown Augusta. I love that place as a go-to Maine shop.
Tiny home trend, is it here to stay or not?
I think it's here to stay in terms of the house sizes decreasing. You're already seeing that. I think it was like 2,430 square feet, something like that was the national average in 2022 for a home size, and now that's down to closer to 2,000. So I don't necessarily think you're going to see a tremendous amount of 400 square foot homes everywhere, but I do see this downward pressure on home sizes, and frankly, that's mostly a function of price. I mean, it's about $300 a square foot now to build.
Ever sold a house sight unseen?
Oh yeah.
Did we just kind of cover that?
Yeah, definitely. I've sold a house sight unseen. Don't recommend it, but sometimes it's really kind of the only way to go given the circumstance.
Do you have a personal favorite town to work in?
Yeah, I mean, I really, really just enjoy Central Maine. I know obviously our office is in Augusta and I've lived there my whole life. It's easy for me to be biased, but it's just such a convenient community to live in, and I love helping people buy and sell in Central Maine.
I think you answered this before, but can you actually buy with no money down?
Yeah, you can definitely buy with no money down.
So obviously there are zero down down payments. What about closing costs?
Yeah, so what would happen is when somebody doesn't really have a lot of money to work with, you would structure their offer in a way that they have the ability to finance those closing costs. So they still have to pay them. Somebody has to pay them. They don't just go away. But what can happen a lot of times is people will say, as an example, let's say the house is listed for $250,000 and the person has like $2,500. Or not even. Let's just say they have $0 and just enough to pay for their inspection and maybe a couple of upfront costs, because that does have to be paid for out of pocket. So realistically, it's hard with $0 because you do have to, if you want to have an inspection, you got to kind of pay for that up front. But let's just say that for all intents, they don't really have much to work with. They would take that $250,000 property and then they would say, well, seller, I'm going to offer you, let's say $265,000, and I want $15,000 back as a credit towards closing costs. That's going to get applied toward whatever maybe is not being paid by the seller for their real estate buyer representation fee, and also, the appraisal and all the other things that go in with getting the property, so that it can get a mortgage. And at closing, what would happen is that buyer would get a loan for $265,000. Their mortgage payments would be amortized based on that loan amount. The seller would get the $250,000 less whatever their costs are, and that $15,000 difference between the $250,000 and the $265,000, that gets to the bank essentially, or whoever is collecting on those closing costs.
If you go that direction, is there a risk that the house doesn't appraise?
Yep, there's a chance that you could get down the road and the property doesn't appraise. In which case, that becomes another negotiation. Worst case scenario, if somebody invested in a property inspection and the seller, let's say this scenario plays out right, $265,000, seller's great, you do inspections, there's some things, but the buyer's like, you know what, they agreed to work with me on, these closing costs, so I'm just not going to ask them for anything. And then they're like, okay, do appraisal. Appraisal comes out, looks at the property, appraiser says, it's worth $257,400. The buyer's like, well, I don't have the other, what would that be, $7,600, to pay the delta between the 265 and the 257.4. So I guess I'm out. Or we go back to the seller and we say, hey seller, look, this place only plays for 257.4. Now the seller might say, well, no, it's worth more than what I'm asking. I want to go back on the market and sell to somebody else for 257.4 that's not asking me to contribute toward the closing costs, because I want to keep that money. Or they may say, I don't want to lose a bird in the hand for two in the bush. I'll take it, Right. And so that the buyer needs to know up front in that scenario. That's why we communicate with people like, hey, we're asking for this, but you may be at risk of losing the money that you invest in the inspection if they choose to do one, if it doesn't appraise and the seller's not willing to adjust the price.
Right. What do you think is the most misunderstood part of the buying process?
I think a lot of times buyers don't think about getting the money lined up first. Like you got to go before you start driving by homes and getting all excited. You have to go get approved for a loan first.
Yep. What is the most bizarre thing you've seen at a showing?
Oh boy. I have, I'm trying to think what's the most bizarre. Boy. I think probably just people like still being at the property in a multifamily and not really being ready for a showing. So like you open up a door and you think everyone's gone and you've announced, hey, I'm here, hello, I'm here, hi, we're showing the property, and then you open the door and someone's like sleeping in the bed.
That's great. I don't know if I ever told you this story, but when I first started in real estate down in Georgia, my very first open house, I got there like 30, 45 minutes early to get set up, and pest control must have just come. It was covered in dead roaches. So and there was nothing in the house. I went over the whole house to find a broom, and my very first task in real estate was to sweep up a bunch of dead roaches. So I'll never forget that.
They never put that on $1 million listings.
Right. All right, Augusta, growing or shrinking?
It's staying the same size. It hasn't shrunk or grown. And part of that is because we haven't added a lot of new housing inventory. And so, that'll come in time as we add more units, the growth.
What's one thing every Maine buyer should know? I get a lot of out-of-state buyers that ask me, what's different about real estate in Maine that I should know that I might not experience in my state?
People put oil tanks in their basements here.
Yeah.
And for people from out of state, a lot of them, that's pretty weird. Like they don't see that. They're used to a natural gas or propane or something. And I've had a lot of out-of-state buyers that are like, why is there a giant tank of fuel oil in the basement? Well, that's how we heat our homes.
Do you need a real estate agent to buy?
Not everybody needs a real estate agent to buy, though I think obviously it's a great idea to have an advisor in your corner to go through the process. But legally, just like you can represent yourself in court, which is probably not always a good idea, you can also represent yourself in the purchase of buying real estate.
What do you need to know if you want to do that?
I mean, it's really critical to make sure that you're negotiating the best possible price. On average, people that are not represented don't always get the best price on properties. And conversely, people, on the selling side, on average, are 12% less when listing on their own than when they list with an agent. So it's about exposure and connections. And also, I would argue that not using a real estate agent doesn't open you to all the options of properties that are available, because a lot of times we're communicating with people that are considering selling that haven't gone on the market yet. And if we're working with you as a buyer, we can alert you of those opportunities.
So speaking of sellers, what are some of the most common questions that sellers ask?
I mean, sellers right now are most concerned, obviously, with price, and is the economy and what's going on in the economy going to affect what I can get for a price on a property? And a lot of times people are not able to disconnect what they're seeing from the macro perspective of the economy from what's really happening locally.
Public water or private well?
I mean, it really depends on, like how much water somebody needs to use in terms of quantity, with comparing private water and a private, well, or public water and a private well, but also the quality of the water is monitored in a public resource. When you have your own, you have to monitor it yourself and be aware of that.
We made it to Belgrade Lakes. Matt, good job. I don't
Yeah.
know how many questions we got in there. I improvised a few.
I think we must have got through at least half of them.
We
I
aimed for
hope.
50. Let's just round up. How's that sound?
Okay.
Honestly, this is why people love Maine. Quiet roads, scenic towns, and views like this. If you're thinking about buying here, make sure you ask questions, lots of them. Hopefully we answered a few of yours today.
And if we didn't answer all your questions, please drop them in the comments below so that we can tackle them, just like the tackle on those fishing boats in our next episode.
Hit like, subscribe for more, and we'll see you back on the road.